I am Walter Hayes, 63 years old, and the first time I understood something was wrong with my own life. I was sitting at my daughter's Thanksgiving table, watching her cut sweet potatoes into a shape she'd learned from her mother, and I heard myself ask a question I had not spoken aloud in 18 years. "Grace," I said, "do you still have Grandpa's fishing lure box?" My daughter's knife stopped moving. She did not look up right away, and in the half-second before she did, I watched the color leave the back of her neck the way water leaves a drain. That question was not really a question. It was a code Grace and I had built together when she was 16 years old and being followed home from her part-time job by a man twice her age who called himself her boyfriend and behaved like her warden. We had built it at our kitchen table on Latimer Street, the two of us alone, on a Tuesday night, because Grace had told me she was afraid to say out loud that she needed help, in case saying it made everything worse. So we made a sentence that meant everything and looked like nothing. A plain question about a dead man's fishing tackle, a way to say I am in danger without anyone else in the room understanding a single word of it. I had built that code to protect my daughter. I had never once imagined that 20 years later I would be the one who needed it, and that I would have to speak it myself, breaking a rule we had never written down but had both always understood. The code belonged to Grace. It was hers to use. I was only ever supposed to be the one who answered. Grace set her knife down on the cutting board with a precision that told me she had heard exactly what I'd said, and exactly how wrong it was for me to be the one saying it. Her husband Marcus was refilling water glasses at the far end of the table. Oblivious, my grandson Eli, 6 years old, was narrating an elaborate battle between two dinner rolls, and across the table, my wife of 31 years, Diane, was laughing at something Marcus's mother had said, her wine glass still half full, her face as warm and open as it had been every day I had known her. "Dad," Grace said carefully, "what did you just ask me?" "I was just wondering if you still had it," I said, keeping my voice light, reaching for the cranberry sauce. "Your grandfather would want it looked after." She looked at me for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds I watched 33 years of trusting me completely collide with something new, something that had just cracked open in her understanding of the evening. She said, "I have it. It's fine," and went back to the sweet potatoes, but her hands were not steady anymore. And twice during the rest of the meal, I caught her watching me across the table, with an expression I recognized, because I had worn it myself for 2 months. The expression of someone doing math they don't want the answer to. If you are watching this from somewhere quiet tonight, a kitchen, a waiting room, a car, in your own driveway, because you're not ready to go inside yet, I want you to know this story is for you. A quick note before we go further. Some names and details here have been adjusted for the sake of the people involved, but the shape of what happened, and the lesson underneath it, is exactly as true as I can make it. If this isn't the kind of story you're looking for tonight, there's no shame in stepping away. But if you've ever sat at your own family's table wondering whether the person across from you is who you think they are, stay with me. I think you'll recognize more of this than you expect. 6 weeks before that Thanksgiving dinner, I had been sitting in a vinyl recliner at the Pinehurst Cancer Center in Spokane, Washington, with a paper gown tied loosely at my collarbone, waiting for a nurse named Renata to hang my 3rd round of a drug called pembrolizumab, the kind of word that takes you 2 tries to say correctly, and that costs, according to the explanation of benefits Diane had always handled for me, somewhere in the neighborhood of $11,000 a dose, before insurance did what insurance does. I had been a machinist for 38 years. The last 22 of them as plant floor supervisor at a precision aerospace parts manufacturer outside the city, the kind of job where a tolerance of 0.003 of an inch is the difference between a part that flies and a part that fails. I had spent my working life learning to notice the tiny deviation before it became the catastrophic one. It is, I have come to understand, the only skill I have ever really had, and it very nearly wasn't enough to save my own life, because the person making the deviations was someone I had trusted with everything I owned for 3 decades. Renata came in with her tablet and her friendly, tired efficiency, and she frowned at the screen the way people frown when a form isn't behaving the way they expect it to. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I'm showing your infusion was canceled 3 weeks ago. Did you switch providers?" I sat very still in that recliner with the paper gown gaping slightly at my chest and felt something in my stomach drop the way a floor drops out from under a chair. Someone has pulled away as a joke. Except nobody in the room was laughing, and nobody in the room seemed to think anything unusual had happened at all. "I didn't cancel anything," I said. Renata's frown deepened into something more careful. "It says here your wife called in the cancellation. Standard procedure. We log it under either patient's name, if they're on the authorized contact list." She turned the tablet toward me, and there it was in the kind of flat, administrative language that makes catastrophe look like paperwork. Patient's wife called 1014, requested discontinuation of treatment per patient's wishes. Patient stated he wanted to stop pursuing aggressive treatment options. Case flagged for oncologist review, no review scheduled. Per patient's wishes. I had never said those words. I had never had that conversation. 3 weeks earlier, on the 14th of October, I had been at work reviewing a batch of turbine housings that had come in 0.04 millimeters out of spec, and at some point during that ordinary Tuesday, my wife had picked up a telephone and, in a voice the clinic staff believed belonged to me, discussing my own wishes through her, ended the single most important medical treatment of my life. I want to be careful here, because 38 years on a factory floor taught me not to jump to conclusions before I have measured twice. There are explanations for confusion. There are mix-ups, crossed wires, forms filled out wrong by tired people at the end of a long shift. I told myself that in the parking lot of the Pinehurst Cancer Center, sitting behind the wheel of my truck with my hands at 10 and 2 like I was 16 years old taking a driving test, because the alternative explanation was one I did not yet have room in my chest for. I did not confront Diane that night. I want you to understand why, because it matters to everything that came after. I had learned, over 38 years of watching men make bad decisions on factory floors, that the moment you announce what you've discovered is the moment the person on the other side of it stops leaving evidence and starts covering it. If something was wrong, I needed to know the shape of it before I said a single word out loud. So I did what I have always done when a machine is running wrong and I don't yet know why. I watched, I listened, I wrote things down in the small notebook I have kept in my shirt pocket since 1987, the kind you buy 3 for $1 at the hardware store, and I did not let my face show anything except the tired, distracted expression of a man recovering from cancer treatment, which, as it turned out, was not difficult to perform, because underneath the watching I actually was that man. Deanne had been my wife since I was 32 years old. We met at a Union Hall dance in 1993, and she had been, for every year I could remember, the person who handled what I could not stand to handle myself. Insurance forms, doctor's appointments, the endless paperwork of a body that had started at 63 to require more maintenance than it used to. When I was diagnosed with stage 3 follicular lymphoma 14 months earlier, Diane had taken over my medical calendar with the brisk, capable competence she brought to everything, and I had been, God help me, grateful for it. I had thanked her for it. I had told friends at the Union Hall how lucky I was that she handled all of it, so I could focus on getting better. I thought about that gratitude a great deal in the weeks that followed. Turning it over the way you turn over a part you've just discovered was machined wrong from the very first cut, wondering how far back the error actually went. I did not sleep well that week. I lay next to Diane in the dark of our bedroom on Kestrel Court and listened to her breathing settle into sleep, and I thought about $11,000 a dose and the 8 infusions I had already received before the 9th one vanished from a schedule I had never been told existed to cancel. The following Monday, I drove back to Pinehurst alone, telling Diane I had a follow-up scan, which was not, strictly speaking, a lie, because I had scheduled one on the drive over using the clinic's app from the truck's parking lot. I sat in the waiting room and asked to speak with my oncologist directly, not through the scheduling desk, not through Renata, but with Dr. Elena Cho herself, And something in the way I asked must have carried further than I intended, because she came out to the waiting room in her white coat within 4 minutes and asked me to come back to her office instead of an exam room. Dr. Cho was younger than most of the people I had spent my career working alongside, maybe 40, with the unhurried exact way of speaking that I had come to associate with people who had learned early in their careers that panic helps no one. She closed her office door and sat across from me, not behind her desk, but in the chair beside mine, which I noticed, because in 38 years of watching how people position themselves in a room, I had learned that the chair someone chooses tells you more than the words that come out of their mouth. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer just as directly. Did you ask your wife to cancel your October 14th infusion?" "No," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I did not." Something moved behind her eyes, not surprise exactly, but the specific recalibration of a person confirming a suspicion she had been carrying alone and hoping was wrong. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to understand I'm telling you because I believe your safety requires it, not because I'm certain of anything yet." She told me that over the past 4 months, 3 separate items related to my treatment had been altered or canceled through calls placed to the clinic's authorization line. A pre-approval renewal in July that had lapsed and required my oncology team to resubmit paperwork with the insurance company, an appointment in September that had been rescheduled twice and then simply never rebooked, and now this. Each time, the caller had identified as either me or my wife acting on my behalf. Each time, the clinic's policy, standard, unremarkable, the kind of thing nobody thinks twice about, had been to record the call for quality assurance, the way nearly every medical office and insurance line in the country does, the small disclosure buried in a recorded greeting that everyone hears and no one really listens to. "I haven't been able to access those recordings myself," Dr. Cho said. "They're held by the call center vendor, and pulling them requires either patient requests through medical records or a formal complaint." "But Mr. Hayes," she paused, and I watched her choose her next words with the same care I would use choosing a torque setting on equipment I didn't fully trust yet. "Your labs from August showed your disease was responding well to treatment. Better than well. You were on track for a strong long-term outcome. I don't understand clinically why anyone would have wanted to stop this treatment, and I think you deserve to understand why either." I sat in that chair with my hands folded in my lap, the way I used to sit across from a plant manager delivering bad news about a production run, and I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still, the particular stillness of a man who has just been told by a professional whose entire job is measuring outcomes precisely that his own body had been doing exactly what it was supposed to do, and someone had stopped it anyway. "I want the recordings," I said, "whatever it takes." "I can help you request them formally," Dr. Cho said. "But Mr. Hayes, if what I'm suspecting is true, I want you to think very carefully before you go home tonight and ask your wife about any of this. If someone has been managing your care without your knowledge, for whatever reason, the safest thing you can do right now is not tip your hand." I thought about the fishing lure box. I thought about Grace at 16 sitting at our kitchen table with a glass of milk she wasn't drinking, telling me in a voice flattened by fear that a man had been following her and she hadn't known how to say it out loud without making it a big thing in case she was wrong. I understood, sitting in Dr. Cho's office 38 years and a lifetime later, that I was now the one who didn't know how to say it out loud in case I was wrong. Except I had already built the tool for exactly this situation. I had simply never expected to need it myself. I drove home. I did not confront my wife. I sat at my workbench in the garage that evening, the one place in the house that had always been entirely mine, and I took my father's fishing lure box down from the shelf where it had sat, mostly untouched, for 11 years since he passed, and I opened it and looked at the hand-tied flies he had made in the 1970s, still pinned neatly in their foam rows, and I thought about how a thing can sit quietly on a shelf for over a decade, unused, and still mean everything the moment someone needs it to. The next morning, I called Grace at the clinic where she worked as a physician assistant and asked her to come by after her shift, alone, without Marcus and without Eli, and to bring nothing with her except herself. She arrived at 6:15 that evening, still in her scrubs, and I met her at the door before she could take her coat off, and I said the words as plainly as I had said them to Dr. Cho. "Something is wrong with your mother," I said, "and I need your help figuring out how wrong." Grace's face did the thing I had watched it do across the Thanksgiving table 5 weeks later, the color leaving slowly from somewhere behind her eyes, and she said, "Dad, you're scaring me." And I said, "Good. I need you scared enough to help me and calm enough to think clearly, and I don't have time to teach you how to hold both of those at once, so you're going to have to trust that I already know how." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had built a code with her 20 years earlier, and I told her everything: the canceled infusion, Dr. Cho's suspicions, the pattern of calls stretching back 4 months, the fact that my cancer had been responding well to a treatment someone had gone out of their way 3 separate times to interrupt. Grace was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said something that split my understanding of the last 4 months wide open in a single sentence. "Dad," she said, "have you looked at the household accounts lately, the joint ones Mom manages?" I hadn't. In 31 years of marriage, I had never once needed to. I was beginning to understand precisely the problem. "Why?" I said. Grace's jaw tightened, and she looked down at the table, and when she looked back up, there was something in her expression I had never seen directed at her mother before. Not accusation exactly, but the specific caution of a daughter who has noticed something and has been quietly, dutifully deciding not to look at it too closely. "Kyle called me last month," she said. Kyle was Diane's son from her first marriage, 38 years old, a man I had helped raise from the age of 9, who I loved without reservation and had never fully trusted, in the specific way you can love someone and still watch them the way you'd watch a piece of equipment that had failed once before. He was drunk. He said some things about owing money to some people who don't send letters when you're late. He said Mom had been helping him. He said it like it was something he assumed I already knew about. I sat back in my chair and felt 38 years of reading tolerances and stress fractures line up into a picture I did not want to see and could no longer avoid seeing. $11,000 a dose. A canceled infusion. A stepson in debt to people who don't send letters. My wife, capable and warm and trusted with everything, sitting at the center of all 3 facts, and none of us yet knowing how deep the connection ran, or what she believed she was protecting when she decided 3 times over 4 months that my treatment was the expense our family could no longer afford. "I need to see those accounts," I said. "And I need to talk to someone who knows how to find money that's been moved somewhere it shouldn't be." Grace reached across the table and took my hand the way I had taken hers 100 times when she was small, and she said, "I know someone. Rosa Delgado. She used to be my supervising nurse before she left to do fraud investigation for the insurance board. She does this for a living now, finding money that shouldn't have moved. I'll call her tonight." Outside the kitchen window, the porch light Diane had installed 3 years ago clicked on with the dusk, automatic, faithful, burning the way it burned every evening, regardless of what was happening underneath the roof it illuminated. I sat at my table with my daughter's hand in mine and understood that the quiet, careful part of my life was over, and the part that required everything I had left in me was only just beginning. "How much time do you think we have?" Grace asked. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I intend to find out before your mother finds out we're looking." Rosa Delgado arrived at my house on Kestrel Court 2 mornings later. Before Diane left for her volunteer shift at the church thrift store, which meant Rosa and I had exactly 40 minutes to talk in my garage with the door down and my radio playing low enough to cover our voices without drawing attention from the kitchen window. She was a compact woman in her 50s with the unhurried economy of movement I had come to recognize in people who spent their careers looking for the one wrong number buried inside 1,000 correct ones. She set a laptop on my workbench, next to a torque wrench I had owned longer than I'd known my wife, and she did not waste time on sympathy before she started asking questions, which I respected more than I could have told her. Grace says you have access to your own bank statements, Rosa said, not joint account summaries. The actual statements, itemized, Diane's handled the bill pay for years, I said, but I can pull them myself. I have the login. I've just never used it. Pull the last 18 months, Rosa said. Everything. And Mr. Hayes, before you look at a single line, I want you to understand something about how this usually goes. People who move money quietly rarely move it in one dramatic theft. They move it in small increments that look, individually, like nothing worth noticing. A transfer here, a missed autopay there, a credit card payment that comes from an account you don't check often. It adds up to something enormous, only when you finally lay it all out, side by side. I spent that evening after Diane went to bed sitting at my workbench with a headlamp clipped to my ball cap, the same headlamp I used for engine work, printing 18 months of statements from 3 accounts I had never once in 31 years thought to examine. By 1 in the morning, I had a picture forming on the concrete floor of my garage that made my hands unsteady in a way 38 years of precision work had never allowed them to be. Between April and October, 11 separate wire transfers had moved out of our joint savings account into an account at a credit union in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, 40 minutes across the state line, totaling just over $61,000. Each transfer was small enough, between $3,000 and $8,000, to avoid the kind of automatic flagging that larger transfers sometimes trigger, and each one had been initiated on a Tuesday, the one day of the week Diane had, for as long as I could remember, called her errand day, the day she did the banking and the grocery shopping, and visited her sister in Coeur d'Alene, a woman named Patrice, who I had met perhaps a dozen times in 31 years, and had never had reason to think about closely. I called Rosa the next morning from my truck in the parking lot of the hardware store, the only place I could think of where a man standing alone talking on the phone would not look unusual. Coeur d'Alene, Rosa said, and I heard her typing before she finished the word. Give me the account routing information from the transfer records if you have it. I did. 38 years of reading serial numbers off turbine parts had made me a careful copier of long strings of digits, and I had written every routing and account number into my hardware store notebook with the same precision I would have used documenting a manufacturing defect. Rosa called back 4 hours later, and I could hear something in her voice that hadn't been there that morning, the specific tightness of a person who has found what they were looking for and doesn't yet know how to say it gently. The receiving account belongs to a man named Dean Fenwick, she said. I can't get much on him through public channels, but I ran what I could. He's had 2 prior judgments against him for unlicensed lending, one in Idaho 11 years ago, one in Washington 4 years ago, both settled before trial. In plain language, Mr. Hayes, that means he lends money to people who can't get it through a bank, at interest rates that would be illegal if he called it a bank loan. And when people don't pay, he has a history of making sure they understand the consequences without ever quite crossing into anything a prosecutor could easily prove. I sat in my truck with the engine off and my hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, the way I had sat in the Pinehurst parking lot 5 weeks earlier, and I thought about Kyle at 38 years old, drunk on the phone with his sister, saying he owed money to people who don't send letters. He's not paying Fenwick directly, I said slowly, working it out the way I would work out a machining problem, one constraint at a time. Diane's paying him, on Kyle's behalf. That would be my read, Rosa said. But Mr. Hayes, there's something else, and I want to be careful how I say this, because I don't have proof yet, only pattern. The dates of these transfers don't just correlate with your wife's Tuesday errand day. 4 of the 11 transfers happened within 72 hours of a canceled or altered item in your treatment schedule. The October 14th cancellation. The July lapse. 2 others in May and August that Dr. Cho's office flagged as unusual reschedulings. I did not say anything for a long moment, because I did not trust my own voice yet to say what needed to be said. She's paying for it with my treatment money, I said finally. Not with money that would have otherwise gone towards something else. With the actual money my insurance premiums and out-of-pocket allowances were supposed to be covering. She's been letting my care lapse specifically on the weeks she needed to move money to Fenwick. I can't confirm the causal link yet, Rosa said. Careful in the way professionals are careful when they know a man is standing on the edge of a conclusion he desperately wants to be wrong. But the timing is not something I'd call coincidence if I saw it in a fraud file. I'd call it a pattern requiring an explanation, and so far, nobody's given us one. I want to pause here and tell you something because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not, in that moment, want revenge. I want to be honest with you about that, because revenge is easy to want and hard to build correctly, and if you go looking for it before you understand what actually happened, you will very often destroy the wrong thing. What I wanted, sitting in that truck outside the hardware store with a headlamp still clipped to my ball cap from the night before, was to understand. I had spent 38 years learning that a part doesn't fail without a reason, and the reason is never the whole truth by itself. Somewhere underneath $61,000 and 3 canceled infusions was a reason, and until I understood it, I would not know what I was actually dealing with. A woman protecting her son out of desperate, misguided love, or something colder that had simply found my illness convenient. That night, I called Grace and asked her to arrange a meeting with Dr. Cho outside clinic hours, somewhere Diane would never think to look for either of us. And Grace suggested the back office of the urgent care clinic where she worked. After closing, on a Thursday when Diane always attended her book club until 9, Dr. Cho met us there with a folder of her own, thin but precise, the way I imagined her charts always were. I filed a formal patient records request for the call recordings, she said. It's moving through the vendor's compliance process, which typically takes 10 to 14 business days. But Mr. Hayes, I want to tell you something in the meantime that I probably shouldn't, and I'm telling you because I believe your safety, both physical and financial, depends on it. She opened the folder. I pulled your chart notes from each of the 3 incidents myself, going back through the documentation trail our staff creates internally, separate from the recorded calls. In each case, the caller, recorded in our system as patient's wife, verified by date of birth and last 4 of SSN on file, used almost identical language each time. She told our scheduling staff that you had decided treatment was, and I'm reading this directly, not worth the financial burden on the family given the likely outcome. Likely outcome, I repeated. Mr. Hayes, your likely outcome, based on your response to treatment, was very good, Dr. Cho said. And there was something in her voice now that had moved past clinical carefulness into something closer to anger held very tightly in check. Whoever made that call either did not understand your prognosis, or understood it and said something false anyway. I thought about Diane sitting across from me at our kitchen table every week, discussing my treatment with what I had believed, until 3 weeks ago, was total and complete engagement. I thought about her hand on my arm in the infusion room during the first round, her voice steady and warm, telling me we were going to get through this together. I thought about 31 years of a woman who had never, not once, given me reason to doubt that when she said together, she meant it. I need those recordings, I said. However long it takes. There may be a faster way, Dr. Cho said quietly. I want to be clear, this isn't something I'm required to offer you, and I need you to understand the limits of what I can do here, without putting my own license at risk. But our clinic's recorded line policy means every call to that authorization desk is retained for 90 days as a standard operational backup, separate from the formal records request process, which exists specifically so staff can review recent calls for training and quality purposes without waiting on compliance approval. I have access to that backup as part of my clinical oversight role. I can listen to it. I cannot legally hand you a copy of it without going through the formal process, but I can listen, and I can tell you, under oath if it comes to that, exactly what I hear. I understood what she was offering, and I understood the careful legal line she was drawing around it, the same kind of line I had spent 38 years drawing around safety procedures on a factory floor. Close enough to help, far enough to survive scrutiny. Listen, I said. Please. She called me 2 days later on a Saturday morning while Diane was at the farmer's market with Grace's mother-in-law, a standing appointment I had, until that week, never once thought to question the convenience of. I listened to the October 14th call, Dr. Cho said, and her voice had a flatness to it that told me she had rehearsed how she was going to say this before she dialed my number. Mr. Hayes. The recording identifies the caller by voice as female. She states her name as your wife. She states that she is calling, and I'm quoting the transcript I made, on behalf of my husband, who's asked me to handle this because it's hard for him to talk about. She goes on to say you'd made the decision together as a family given, again quoting, what the money could be doing for the grandkids instead. I stood in my garage with the phone pressed hard against my ear and felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the specific total stillness that comes just before a piece of machinery you've been monitoring finally, catastrophically fails. There's one more thing, Dr. Cho said, and I want you to hear it directly rather than have someone else describe it to you first. Toward the end of the call, there's a pause, and you can hear what sounds like a second voice in the background, male, brief, not clearly audible on the recording quality we have. The caller, your wife, says, off to the side, away from the phone, but not far enough away, I know. I'm handling it. Give me a minute. Then she comes back to the line and finishes the cancellation. A second voice, I said. I can't identify who it belongs to from the recording alone, Dr. Cho said. But Mr. Hayes, whoever it was, your wife was managing two conversations in that moment. One with our office, ending your treatment, and one with someone standing close enough to hear her doing it, who she felt she needed to reassure mid-call that she was, in her words, handling it. I thanked Dr. Cho and hung up the phone and stood in my garage for a long time with my hand resting on the fishing lure box, and I thought about Kyle, and I thought about a man named Dean Fenwick who did not send letters, and I thought about the particular kind of desperation that makes a person believe that ending one person's treatment is a reasonable price for protecting another person's safety, even when the two people in question are, respectively, her husband of 31 years and her son from a marriage that ended before I ever met her. I called Grace that evening and told her everything Dr. Cho had shared. There was a long silence on the line before Grace spoke again, and when she did, her voice had gone very quiet and very careful, the voice she must have used, I imagined, when delivering hard news to patients in the urgent care exam rooms where she worked. Dad, she said, I think we need to talk to Kyle directly, before we talk to Mom. If he knows what she's been doing or if he doesn't, either way, he's the only person who can tell us how deep this actually goes with Fenwick, and how much danger he might still be in. You think there's more coming, I said. I think, Grace said, that a man who runs unlicensed lending doesn't stop asking for money just because you paid him $61,000 over 6 months. I think people like that treat every payment as proof you'll keep paying. She was right. And I knew she was right in the same way I had known, standing on a factory floor for 38 years, when a machine that had just been repaired was going to fail again within the week. Not because the repair was wrong, but because nobody had yet found the actual source of the strain. We found Kyle 2 nights later at a bar off Sprague Avenue that he'd mentioned once, months earlier, in a way that made me remember it without quite meaning to. Grace went in alone first because Kyle trusted her in a way he had never entirely trusted me, not out of any failure on my part, but out of the ordinary, understandable distance between a stepfather and a stepson who had been 9 years old and already grieving a different life when I arrived in it. I waited outside in my truck, in the cold, watching the door, my headlamp still sitting uselessly on the passenger seat from 3 nights of garage work, and after 20 minutes, Grace came out with Kyle beside her, unsteady but not drunk, wearing the specific hollowed-out expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long that being asked about it directly feels almost like relief. He got in the back seat of my truck without being asked, and for a long moment none of us said anything, the 3 of us sitting in the cold dark of a bar parking lot with the engine running for heat. How much do you owe him? I said finally. Not a question. A number I needed. Kyle's voice, when it came, was smaller than I had ever heard it, smaller than it had been even at 9 years old, on the day his mother introduced us, and he'd looked at me like I was an intrusion he hadn't been consulted about. 94,000, he said. It started at 12. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds, and I've had 11 months to feel exactly as bad about it as I should. And Mom's been paying him, Grace said gently. Not a question either. Kyle nodded slowly in the rearview mirror, and then he said something that landed in the cab of that truck like a stone dropped into still water, something that reframed everything. I thought I understood about the last 4 months. She told me she had it handled, he said. She told me not to worry, that she was moving money from. He stopped, and I watched his face in the mirror do the same thing Grace's face had done at the Thanksgiving table. The specific arithmetic of realizing what a sentence actually meant only after it had already left your mouth. She told me she was moving money from an account that wasn't really needed anymore. That's what she said. Not needed anymore. Walter. I swear to God, I thought she meant retirement savings. I never once thought. His voice broke, and for a moment none of us said anything at all. Just 3 people sitting in a cold truck outside a bar, listening to the engine idle and the heater tick. She told Fenwick something else too, Kyle said finally, quieter. About 3 weeks ago. I was there when she called him, in her car, in a parking lot. She didn't know I could hear through the door. I'd left open getting something out of the trunk. She told him the payments would keep coming steady for a while longer. Because, and I'm using her words here, because there was, he stopped again. And this time when he continued, his voice had gone flat, with something that sounded almost like horror at his own memory. Because there was a policy that would clear the rest once things ran their course. That's what she said. Once things ran their course. I sat very still in the driver's seat of my own truck and felt the last piece of the picture settle into place, with a click as final and as cold as a machined part locking into its housing. A policy. My life insurance policy. The one I had carried through the union for 26 years. The one that would pay out, upon my death, considerably more than $94,000. Considerably more, in fact, than the $61,000 already gone, and whatever remained to be paid to a man in Coeur d'Alene who did not send letters. I did not say anything for a long time. Grace reached back and put her hand on Kyle's knee, and he was crying now. Silently, the particular silent crying of a grown man who understands too late what his own desperation allowed someone else to justify. I didn't know, he said. Walter, I swear to you, I didn't know that's what she meant. I thought she was talking about an old savings bond. I would never have let her do that to you. Not for this. Not for any, believed him. I want you to understand that clearly. Because this story is not about punishing every person who made a mistake inside it. Kyle's mistake had been desperation and silence, and 38 years of a complicated relationship with a stepfather he'd never quite let himself lean on. Diane's mistake, if that is even the right word for what she had done, was something else entirely. Something with a shape I would not fully understand until I stood, 2 weeks later, in a room with a recording device authorized by a lawyer I had not yet met, listening to my wife's voice explain, in words she believed no one but the man on the other end of the phone would ever hear, exactly how much my life was worth to her, measured against my death. We're going to fix this, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to, steadier than I had any right to feel, but we're going to fix it the right way. Nobody in this truck is calling the police tonight. Nobody's confronting your mother tomorrow morning at breakfast. We are going to build this the way I used to build a repair plan on the factory floor. Measure everything twice. Understand the full failure before you touch a single part, and only then do you put your hands on the machine. Kyle wiped his face with the heel of his hand and nodded. And Grace looked at me across the cab of that truck with an expression I recognized because I had worn it myself 20 years earlier at our kitchen table, teaching her a code word for danger she hadn't yet found the courage to speak. It was the look of someone realizing their father was not simply grieving, he was building something. What do you need from us? Grace said. A lawyer, I said. The kind who understands insurance fraud and elder financial exploitation, even though I hate that phrase and I'm not sure yet if it's the right one, and Kyle, I turned to look at him directly, in the mirror, the closest I could manage from the driver's seat. I need you to call Fenwick one more time. Not to pay him, to find out exactly what he's expecting and when, because whatever's coming, I intend for it to arrive on my terms, not his and not your mother's. Sandra Whitfield's office was on the fourth floor of a converted mill building near the river, and she listened to the entire account, Rose's transfer records, Dr. Cho's description of the recorded calls, Kyle's confession in the truck, without interrupting once, the way a person listens when they are already 3 steps ahead, building the legal shape of what they're hearing before the speaker finishes. What you're describing, she said finally, sits at the intersection of 2 things: insurance fraud because someone impersonated you or claimed to speak for you to alter medical benefits you were entitled to, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, which in Washington doesn't require you to be elderly in the way people assume. It requires that your capacity to manage your own affairs was compromised by illness, and someone with access to your finances took advantage of that. A cancer diagnosis, active treatment, documented cognitive fatigue from chemotherapy. You qualify, Mr. Hayes, whether that sits comfortably with you or not. It doesn't sit comfortably, I said. It rarely does, Sandra said. But the law isn't built around your comfort. It's built around what actually happened to you. She filed a formal expedited records request the same afternoon, citing an active pattern of financial exploitation, and within 6 days, far faster than the 14 the vendor had originally quoted, 3 certified recordings arrived at her office, each one a small, flat digital file that somehow contained inside it the entire architecture of what my wife had done. I listened to them once, alone in Sandra's conference room, with Grace sitting beside me and Sandra across the table with a legal pad and a pen she never once used. I will not describe every word of it to you, because some things a man is entitled to keep for himself even after he has decided to share everything else. But I will tell you this. Diane's voice on those recordings was warm. It was patient with the scheduling staff. It apologized twice for the inconvenience of canceling my care. It sounded, in every recorded second, exactly like the woman I had shared a bed with for 31 years, and that, more than the $61,000, more than Dean Fenwick, more than any single fact in the entire investigation, was the thing that broke something loose in my chest that I had been holding very carefully in place since the day Renata frowned at her tablet. You cannot fake warmth for that long, in that many separate moments, unless some part of you genuinely believes what you're doing is protecting someone. That understanding did not undo what had happened to me, but it changed what I intended to do about it, and I want you to sit with that distinction for a moment because I think it is the most important thing this story has to offer you. Justice and cruelty are not the same instrument, and a man who confuses them usually ends up wielding neither one correctly. The Union Hall's annual holiday banquet fell 9 days after I listened to those recordings. Diane had chaired the planning committee for 11 years running, the kind of quiet, competent volunteer work that had made her, in the eyes of everyone I had worked alongside for 4 decades, something close to beloved. 300 retirees and their families would fill the hall that Saturday night, eating a catered dinner under the same rafters where I had once, as a much younger man, learned to run a lathe. Kyle called Fenwick on the Wednesday before the banquet, exactly as I had asked him to, and learned what I had suspected. A final balloon payment of $31,000 was due the following week, the last installment, before Fenwick considered the debt settled in full. A phrase Kyle repeated to me with a bitterness that told me he understood, finally and completely, what that settlement had been quietly designed to wait for. I did not plan a confrontation at the banquet. I want to be honest with you about that because Sandra had been clear with me, in the careful language of a lawyer who has seen good cases ruined by bad timing, that nothing I did in the days ahead should look like ambush or public humiliation, not because Diane didn't deserve honesty, but because the case we were building needed to stand on evidence, not spectacle. What I planned, instead, was smaller and in its own way, harder. I planned to tell her, quietly at home, that I knew everything and to watch what she did next. But my wife, it turned out, had plans of her own for that Saturday night, and I did not learn what they were until we were both standing under the same rafters where I had learned to run a lathe, and Kyle, who had not been invited to the banquet in 11 years. Ever since a disagreement with Diane's sister I'd never fully understood. Walked in through the side entrance at 8:15, unannounced, with Dean Fenwick's final payment demand printed out and folded in his jacket pocket, because he had decided on his own, without asking any of us first, that he was done being managed by his mother's silence. I saw him before Diane did. I watched him cross the hall toward our table, past 300 people eating rubber chicken and half listening to the plant manager's annual remarks, and I understood, with the particular dread of a man watching a machine run past its safety tolerance, that whatever was about to happen was no longer entirely in my control. "Mom," Kyle said, low enough that only our table heard him, but not so low that the tables nearest us didn't turn. "I need to talk to you now." Diane's face did the thing I had watched Grace's face do at Thanksgiving, and Kyle's face do in the truck. The specific arithmetic of understanding, arriving a half-second too late to stop what was already happening. "Kyle, this isn't the place," she said, reaching for his arm. "Fenwick wants $31,000 by Friday," Kyle said, and his voice cracked but did not lower. "I know where the last 61 came from, Mom. I know it came out of Walter's treatment money. I know you told him the rest would clear once things, and I'm quoting you, ran their course. I heard you say it. I've spent 2 weeks not sleeping because I heard you say it." The hall did not go silent all at once, the way it does in movies. It went silent in a spreading circle, table by table, as the words traveled outward from ours. And by the time the plant manager stopped speaking at the podium and the room's attention swung fully toward us, Diane was standing with both hands flat on the tablecloth, staring at her son, and I was watching a version of my wife's face I had genuinely never seen before. Not warmth, not competence, not the practiced calm of 31 years, but something raw and cornered and, for just a moment, unmistakably afraid. "That's not," she started and stopped, because there was nowhere for that sentence to go that would survive contact with what Kyle had just said in front of 300 people. I stood up slowly. I had not planned this. I want you to understand that clearly. But 38 years of watching machines fail had taught me that sometimes the moment arrives, whether you scheduled it or not, and the only choice left to you is whether you meet it standing still or standing up. "Diane," I said, and my voice came out quieter than the room, which somehow made it carry further than shouting would have. "I have the recordings from the clinic. I've had them for 9 days. Something in her face collapsed inward at that. The specific collapse of a person who has just understood that every version of the story she had rehearsed for this eventual moment has already been overtaken by evidence she didn't know existed. "Walter," she said, and her voice had gone very small. "Please, not here. You told the clinic I decided my own treatment wasn't worth the financial burden," I said. "You told Fenwick the debt would clear once, and these are your words. Things ran their course. I have both of those statements in a recording certified by the clinic's compliance office. I have 18 months of bank statements showing $61,000 moving to a man with 2 prior judgments for illegal lending. I know about the policy, Diane. I know exactly what your account on. I watched 300 people who had known my wife for 11 years of volunteer banquets absorb, in real time, the full shape of what I was saying, and I watched Diane understand that there was no longer a version of this conversation that could be quietly redirected back into privacy. She did not deny it. I want to tell you that clearly, because I think it matters more than anything else that happened that night. She stood at that table, in front of everyone, and she did not deny a single word. "He would have died anyway," she said, and her voice broke completely on the word died, the practiced calm gone entirely now, replaced by something that sounded horribly like relief at finally being allowed to say it out loud. "The oncologist gave us numbers, Walter, early on, before the treatment started working the way it did. I heard survival statistics that made me think I was watching you spend our retirement, our grandchildren's inheritance, on months, not years. And Kyle was going to get hurt, Walter. Really hurt. Fenwick doesn't send letters. I thought, God help me, I thought I was choosing between saving one child I could still save and extending a few months for a man who was already. She stopped herself before the word left her mouth, but everyone in that hall heard the shape of it anyway. Already gone. I stood there and let the silence hold for a long moment. Because I had learned across 4 decades on a factory floor that the most important thing you can do after a catastrophic failure is resist the urge to fill the silence before you understand exactly what it's telling you. I was responding to treatment, I said finally. Dr. Cho told me herself. My outcome was good, Diane. Better than good. You didn't just gamble with a few months. You gambled with years, and you did it without asking me, because you decided you already knew the answer I would give if you had. Grace was beside me now, and Kyle was standing where he'd stopped, tears on his face, and somewhere in the crowd I heard someone's chair scrape back, and I understood that the public part of this, the part that could not be undone, the part that would follow Diane through every future gathering in this hall for as long as either of us lived, was already finished. What remained was private, and it was mine to decide how to handle, not the 300 people watching us. We're going home, I said to Diane, quietly enough now that it belonged only to the two of us. Not to talk about this the way you've been managing conversations for the last 6 months, to talk about it the way it should have been handled from the beginning, honestly, between us, before either of us decides what happens next. We drove home in separate cars. I do not know what Diane thought about on that drive, and I have never fully asked her, because by the time we sat down together at our kitchen table that night, the same table where I had built a code word with my daughter 20 years earlier, the same table where Grace had told me, weeks before, that something was wrong with her mother, there was very little left to say that the recordings and the bank statements and 300 witnesses hadn't already said for us. Sandra Whitfield filed the formal complaint the following Monday on my behalf with both the State Insurance Fraud Division and Adult Protective Services, and Rosa Delgado's financial documentation went with it. 18 months of transfers laid out in a spreadsheet as precise as any tolerance chart I had ever signed off on. Kyle, separately on Sandra's advice, reported Dean Fenwick to the Idaho Department of Finance's Consumer Lending Division, which had apparently been building a file on him for years and had simply been waiting for someone willing to testify. Fenwick was charged 11 weeks later with unlicensed lending and criminal extortion. Based partly on Kyle's testimony and partly on records Rosa had helped trace connecting him to at least 6 other families across 2 states. Deanne's case moved slower, the way these things do, through 8 months of proceedings that I will not walk you through in detail except to tell you the outcome, because I think it matters. The prosecutor's office, weighing the recordings against Diane's full cooperation once confronted, against a lifetime with no prior offense, against the genuine documented threat Fenwick had posed to her son, offered a plea to a reduced charge, attempted insurance fraud, and a single count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, with restitution of the full $61,000, 5 years of probation, and mandatory financial counseling in lieu of prison time. I did not object to that outcome, and I want to tell you why, because I know some of you listening tonight will feel it was too gentle. Justice, I have come to believe, is not the same thing as the harshest available consequence. It is the consequence that fits the actual shape of what happened, measured honestly, without either excusing the harm or pretending the person who caused it was simply a monster wearing my wife's face for 31 years. Diane made a catastrophic, unforgivable decision to protect our son from a danger that was, by every account I could verify, entirely real. That does not undo what she did to me. It does explain it, and there is a difference between an explanation and an excuse that I think this whole story ultimately turns on. We divorced that spring. It was, by mutual agreement, one of the few uncomplicated parts of the entire ordeal. Diane moved to Coeur d'Alene, closer to her sister, and closer, I understood without asking, to a version of her life she could rebuild without 300 people in a union hall. Remembering the night, everything came apart at once. My treatment resumed the week after the banquet. this time with Grace listed as my primary authorized contact on every form, and this time with Dr. Cho personally reviewing any change to my schedule before it was processed. 8 months later, at my follow-up scan, she told me what I had been waiting 14 months to hear: no evidence of active disease. Complete response. The kind of outcome, she reminded me gently, that the treatment someone once tried to take from me had made possible. Last Thanksgiving, a full year after the one where I broke my own rule and spoke a code word that was never mine to use, I sat at Grace and Marcus's table again, healthier than I had any right to expect to be, and my grandson Eli, 7 years old now, was explaining to the table why his sweet potato castle needed a moat. When he looked up at me, with the particular seriousness only a 7-year-old can summon, and asked me a question that had nothing to do with lure boxes or codes or any secret at all. "Grandpa," he said, "why did you get sick and then not sick again?" I thought about how to answer a 7-year-old honestly without frightening him, and what came out of me instead was something simpler and truer than anything I had managed to say in 8 months of depositions and hearings. Because some people told the truth when it was hard to, I said, and I got to keep going because of it. Ellie considered that with the gravity he brings to everything, then nodded like it settled something and went back to his moat. The fishing lure box sits on a shelf in my garage again, exactly where it always has, except now Eli knows what's inside it, and last month I taught him to tie his first fly, his small hands clumsy and patient at my workbench, the way mine once were at my own father's. I did not teach him the code word. I hope, with everything I have left in me, that he never needs one. But if the day ever comes that he does, I want him to know it will be waiting for him, the same way it was waiting for me. 20 years after, I thought I'd built it for someone else entirely. If this story reached you tonight, wherever you're listening from, type the word steady in the comments. I read every single one, and I'd like to know you made it to the end with me. A final note before you go. Some details in tonight's story were adjusted for the privacy of the people involved, but the truth underneath it stands exactly as I've told it. If someone in your life has quietly taken over the parts of your world you trusted them with completely, I hope this story gave you permission to look a little closer sooner than I did. Subscribe if you'd like to walk through more of these with me. There are more stories ahead, and I have a feeling some of them will feel closer to home than you expect.